Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast. Imagine, for a second, that you wake up, you pour your morning coffee and you turn on the news.
Right, the usual morning routine.
Yeah, exactly, the usual routine. And you see a world leader making a decision that just, it completely defies logic.
Like a totally erratic move.
Exactly. Like maybe it's a bizarre tariff or some completely erratic diplomatic threat or a rambling speech that just seems entirely disconnected from reality.
Which, feels pretty common these days.
Right. And normally, as a spectator of global events, you and I might sit back and just try to rationalize it. We look for that hidden 4D chess move.
We want to find the logic.
We do. We assume it's some brilliant, unorthodox political strategy that's, designed to leverage economic indicators or outmaneuver a rival. But what if we are completely fundamentally wrong?
That is the big question.
What if the chaos we are watching isn't a strategy at all?
It is a terrifying premise, isn't it? I mean, the idea that we are out here searching for geopolitical logic in a place where essentially only biology remains.
Exactly. And that is exactly why today's deep dive is tailored specifically for you. Because, you are someone who refuses to just accept the surface level noise of the daily news cycle.
Right, you want to dig deeper.
Yeah. You want the hidden layers. You want the fundamental truths behind the headlines, but without drowning in impenetrable academic jargon. So today, we are looking at a stack of incredibly provocative source material.
It's extremely dense. Yeah.
It is. It posits this radical, deeply clinical, and almost dialectical analysis of global power. The core argument here is just staggering. It suggests that the chaotic, baffling nature of recent geopolitics, specifically the events of the last 2 years and the projections heading into 2025 and 2026, it isn't just a matter of unorthodox political maneuvering.
No, it's far more biological than that.
Right. The text argues that what we are witnessing on the world stage is a literal biological neuropathology. We are talking about taking a medical framework, like a literal diagnostic lens, and applying it directly to global power dynamics.
So before we go any further, I feel like I need to establish a very firm, very calm, and very clear baseline for our discussion today.
Yeah, please do. This is important.
It is. Because the source material you and I are unpacking, it contains highly charged political, philosophical, and clinical claims. It specifically critiques the broader capitalist system through a Marxist lens, and it makes direct medicalized diagnostic assertions regarding Donald Trump and his administration's actions.
Yeah.
So I want to state unequivocally to our listener that we, as the hosts of this deep dive, are not taking political sides here.
Absolutely no.
We are not medical professionals diagnosing anyone from afar, nor are we endorsing these specific political viewpoints, the left-wing or right-wing paradigms, or the dialectical materialist ideology presented in these texts.
Yeah, we are strictly neutral here.
Exactly. Our only goal today is to impartially unpack the fascinating theoretical arguments, the historical metaphors, and the medical frameworks exactly as they are presented in this specific stack of research. We are here to explore the ideas as they are written and to help you understand the very specific lens through which these authors are viewing the world.
I couldn't agree more. We are just the neutral guides through this incredibly dense forest of ideas. And honestly, the craziest part about this text is where it begins. Because to understand the geopolitics presented in these sources, we can't start with maps. We can't start with treaties or trade agreements. Before we talk about global politics, we have to talk about the human brain.
Which is really the only logical place to start if you follow the author's premise. I mean, the text insists that we cannot possibly understand the gravitational pull of power, why it's so irresistible, why people will do anything to keep it, and why it changes them so profoundly unless we first understand the biological hardware of the human nervous system.
Hardware, I love that analogy.
Right. Because the authors argue that we treat power as an abstract social construct. We think of it as like a title on a door or a signature on a bill. But to the human brain, power is not abstract.
It's physical.
It's a potent, tangible, neurological stimulus. It physically alters the neurochemistry and the actual neural architecture of the individual wielding it.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the way the text describes this mechanism, it's going out of its way to say this is not a metaphor.
It's very literal.
It is. When you get power, It is comparing the acquisition and the exercise of that power to a literal narcotic addiction.
Mm.
It's saying that when a leader commands an army or move billions of dollars with a pen stroke or stands in front of a stadium of screaming fans, their brain is undergoing a chemical reaction that is practically indistinguishable from hitting a pipe or taking a massive dose of a powerful illicit drug.
That is the exact biological reality the source is present. To understand the how and the why, the research points specifically to the brain's reward centers. So the primary actors here are the nucleus accumbens and the striatum.
Okay, the nucleus accumbens.
Right. To give you some context, if you eat a piece of cake when you're starving or you win a game of poker, these regions activate.
You feel good.
Exactly. But when an individual anticipates a massive reward or successfully exercises absolute authority over others, these regions are absolutely flooded with dopamine.
And dopamine is the pleasure chemical, right? So they just feel really, really good.
Well, it's often simplified as just the pleasure chemical, but in neurology, it's understood as much more than that. Dopamine is the core neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, for goal-directed behavior, and for raw biological energy.
So it's not just I like this, it's I need to do this.
Yes, precisely. It tells the brain, whatever you just did to get this feeling, do it again and do it with more intensity. So when a leader exerts control and gets that massive dopaminergic wave, it triggers a state of euphoria, heightened energy, and a laser-like, almost obsessive focus. It creates a literal chemical high.
But I'm thinking about how the human body works in other contexts. Like, if I drink a cup of coffee every day, eventually one cup doesn't wake me up anymore.
Right, your body adjusts.
Yeah, I need two, then I need three. The brain doesn't just sit there and let you flood it with dopamine forever without trying to balance things out, does it?
No, it doesn't. You're describing homeostasis. The brain is always seeking a balanced baseline. When the brain is constantly bombarded by these unnaturally high levels of dopamine due to the continuous exercise of absolute power, it has a defense mechanism.
Which is what?
The dopamine receptors, specifically what we call the D2 receptors, begin to desensitize. They downregulate.
Oh, wow.
Imagine walking into a room where a smoke alarm is blaring. At first, it's deafening. But if you stand there for hours, your brain starts to muffle the sound to protect your sanity. To get your attention again, the alarm would have to be twice as loud.
So the leader develops a biological tolerance to power.
Exactly. This is the exact literal mechanism of substance addiction.
That makes so much sense when you look at how politicians evolve. The things that used to give them that rush of power early in their careers no longer work.
They're just immune to it.
Right, like passing a standard piece of legislation or firing a mid-level intern or getting a polite round of applause at a town hall. It doesn't move the needle anymore. They need a bigger hit.
To feel that same baseline level of satisfaction and energy, they require increasingly massive stimuli. In a geopolitical context, this translates to a desperate need for more control.
Like what?
It manifests as dominating larger territories, demanding more euphoric, almost religious crowds at rallies, or engaging in incredibly risky, aggressive foreign policies. The text draws on historical examples here, looking at figures like Napoleon or Hitler, and suggests that their irrational, self-destructive drive to expand, even after they had achieved absolute secure success, wasn't just strategic hubris.
It was a craving.
It was a physiological compulsion. The reward-seeking behavior shifts from being impulsive, doing something for pleasure, to being compulsive, doing something simply to avoid the agony of withdrawal.
And let's talk about that withdrawal, because the text makes a point here that I found absolutely chilling to think about. For a leader in this neurochemically altered state, losing an election or losing power isn't just a political defeat. It's not a blow to their legacy or a dent in their pride.
No, not at all.
It triggers a literal neurochemical withdrawal syndrome.
It is a profound medical event. When the dopamine tap is suddenly shut off, the downregulated D2 receptors are left starving. The leader experiences profound anhedonia.
Anhedonia.
Yes, which is the absolute inability to feel pleasure from anything in normal life. This is accompanied by crippling anxiety, paranoia, and a deep existential panic.
If we think about it that way, it totally changes how we view authoritarianism. It explains the irrational, sometimes completely self-destructive tenacity with which autocrats cling to their positions.
They're fighting for their lives, chemically speaking.
Right. When they are burning down their own countries to stay in power, they aren't making a rational calculation about their post-political careers or their place in history. Their brain is interpreting the loss of status as a literal biological threat to its survival. It is a chemical crisis, It's life or death to the cells in their head.
Which brings us to an incredibly tragic irony that the sources highlight, coined by the psychologist Dietrich Keltner as the power paradox.
Right, the power paradox. The idea that to get power, you usually need to be pretty good with people. You have to listen, compromise, read a room, maybe even show some genuine empathy.
You have to build coalitions.
Exactly. You have to convince people you care about them so they'll vote for you or promote you. But once you actually get the power.
Once you get the power, the neurological changes we just discussed actively destroy the very traits that allowed you to ascend in the first place.
That's just wild.
It is. The empathy, the collaboration, the social intelligence, they are systematically dismantled by the possession of power itself.
And again, what's wild is that they aren't just philosophizing here. The source material brings the biological receipts. They talk about actual functional MRI scans, fMRIs of individuals who have held power for long periods.
Yes, the neurological evidence.
The scans show a physical, observable suppression of the mirror neuron system. Can you explain how mirror neurons actually work for us normally?
Mirror neurons are essentially the physiological foundation of human empathy. Let's say you are watching a friend slicing vegetables in the kitchen, and the knife slips, and they cut their finger. You physically wince.
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
Right, you might even grab your own hand. That is your mirror neuron system firing. These neurons fire not only when we perform an action or feel an emotion, but when we observe someone else performing that action or experiencing that emotion.
So it's simulated for us.
They allow us to mentally simulate what another person is going through. It is how we intuitively understand pain and joy in others.
So when an fMRI shows that power suppresses these neurons, it means the leader literally, physically loses the capacity to understand the pain of the people they are ruling over. They lose it at the hardware level.
Yes. The text actually goes so far as to compare the brains of people with long-term unchecked power to patients who have suffered a traumatic brain injury. Specifically, it compares them to patients with damage to the orbitofrontal cortex.
Wait, like someone who was in a severe car crash and hit the front of their head on the steering wheel.
Exactly like that. When the orbitofrontal cortex is damaged in a physical trauma, the patient exhibits severe impulsivity, a massive reduction in risk awareness, and a complete blunting of the ability to read social cues.
Because that part of the brain is just offline.
Exactly. They might make highly inappropriate jokes at a funeral, for example, because the brain can no longer process the social reality of the room. The source material argues that absolute power induces an acquired version of this exact brain damage. If a leader can no longer mirror the emotions of the people around them, if they don't instinctively feel sadness when the populace is suffering, or fear when the populace is terrified, they stop perceiving those people as fully human.
They just become numbers on a spreadsheet or pieces on a board.
And that creates a terrifying feedback loop. The lack of empathy makes it incredibly easy to make ruthless, cruel decisions. Those cruel decisions isolate the leader further, severing their remaining ties to reality.
Because everyone around them is too scared to tell them the truth.
Right, and to manage the fallout of their cruelty, they have to rely on ever more oppressive methods to maintain the control that their addicted brain demands to stave off withdrawal. It is a downward biological spiral.
Okay, so if this neurobiology, the dopamine spikes, the fried mirror neurons, the orbitofrontal cortex damage, the excruciating withdrawal, that is the hardware of power, the source text argues that philosophy provides the software.
It does.
It gives us the language to understand how this damaged, addicted hardware actually expresses itself in human history and global politics.
Indeed. The text is very rigorous in grounding this clinical analysis in a deep philosophical tradition. It views the drive for power not as an aberration or a mistake of human nature, but as the fundamental driving force of existence itself.
So it's baked into us.
According to this view, yes. To frame this, the authors draw heavily on the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically his concept of the will to power.
Right, Nietzsche, the guy who usually gets quoted out of context in edgy movies. What does the will to power actually mean in this context?
Nietzsche argued against the idea that living beings just want to passively survive or exist in peace. He posited that the core underlying drive of all living things is to expand, to impose their will upon their environment, to grow, to conquer, and to dominate.
So just mere survival isn't enough.
Never. An oak tree doesn't just want to survive. It wants to spread its canopy and choke out the saplings below it to get more sun. For a political leader, the text argues, the exercise of absolute power over a nation is the purest, most undiluted expression of this vital biological energy.
Wow. The text also brings in the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell. I love the analogy he used. He said that power is to the social sciences what energy is to physics.
It's a brilliant comparison.
It really is. It's the fundamental currency of everything that happens. You can't understand physics without understanding energy, and you can't understand human society without understanding power. But the terrifying difference is that while a lion will hunt, eat its fill, and then go sleep under a tree for 12 hours, human desires are infinite.
That concept of infinite desire bridges perfectly into the work of Thomas Hobbes. In his foundational text, Leviathan, Hobbes outlined what we now call the security dilemma. He described human existence as a restless, continuous desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death.
Only in death. That's so bleak.
It is bleak.
Mm.
But crucially, Hobbes pointed out something that connects right back to the neurochemical withdrawal we discussed. This endless quest isn't just about seeking the pleasure of dominance. It is driven fundamentally by fear.
Because if you have power, someone else wants it.
Exactly. You have to acquire more power today simply to secure the power you acquired yesterday. You cannot stand still on the treadmill of dominance. Stopping is entirely equivalent to falling.
So there's no such thing as maintaining the status quo for them.
None at all. If you are a dictator, you can't just pause and say, okay, I have enough power now, I'll just maintain this level.
Yeah.
The moment you stop expanding your control, your rivals sense weakness and you are destroyed.
It's like a shark that has to keep swimming to breathe. And when you trace this philosophy into the modern era, the text pulls in the French philosopher Michel Foucault and his incredibly potent idea of biopolitics.
Yes, biopolitics.
The text points out that in medieval times, a king's power was largely defined by the right of the sword, the right to execute you. It was the power over death. But Foucault argued that modern power is far more invasive. The modern leader doesn't just threaten death, they manage life itself.
Yes, the modern state manages birth rates, healthcare, borders, diets, and sanitation. The text uses a very evocative phrase. The modern leader views themselves as the gardener of the human species.
The gardener. That's so chilling.
They dictate who thrives, who gets resources, who is marginalized, and who is allowed to wither.
And when you have an addicted, empathy-deficient brain put in charge of that garden, when you give them the tools of biopolitics, that level of control is intoxicating. It confers a literal godlike status.
And this philosophical setup perfectly primes the discussion for a very specific, recognizable clinical condition that arises when a human brain is placed in that godlike environment. The text introduces the concept of Hubris Syndrome.
Right, Hubris Syndrome.
This isn't just a literary term. It was developed as a serious medical proposal by Lord David Owen, who was a British Foreign Secretary and a physician, along with the psychiatrist Jonathan Davidson.
No, wait, let me push back here for a second, because I'm looking at the list of symptoms they describe for hubris syndrome. The arrogance, the grandiosity, the complete lack of empathy, the obsession with image. Wait, isn't this just classic narcissism? I mean, we hear the word narcissist thrown around constantly in political analysis, and usually by everyday people talking about their exes. What makes this any different?
What's fascinating here is the vital structural distinction the text makes between narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, and hubris syndrome. Classic narcissism is generally viewed by psychologists as a lifelong personality trait.
Like it's just who they are.
It is a structural element of how that person's ego was formed, almost always stemming from early childhood trauma or developmental issues. A classic narcissist is a narcissist, whether they are the president of a country or a barista at a coffee shop.
So it's baked into their personality from day one.
Right. Hubris syndrome, on the other hand, is an acquired condition. It is an occupational hazard.
Oh, like getting a repetitive strain injury.
Essentially, yes. It is a state that is brought on specifically by the possession of power for a prolonged period. More specifically, it is triggered by power that has been overwhelmingly successful and is free from standard checks and balances. It is a syndrome of the office as much as the individual.
That is wild.
You can have a relatively normal, grounded person enter a position of absolute power and over a decade acquire hubris syndrome. And crucially, because it is acquired through the environment, it can potentially regress and heal if the individual loses power and undergoes that withdrawal phase.
That is a wild distinction. So the office literally infects the brain. The text outlines 5 core criteria for diagnosing hubris syndrome, and as you read through them, it feels like looking at the blueprints for every historical disaster of the last century.
Let's explore how these criteria manifest in a leader's behavior. The first is what Owen and Davidson call the messianic position.
Messianic, like a savior.
Yes, the leader ceases to view the world as a complex geopolitical reality and instead views it primarily as an arena, a theatrical stage, for them to exercise power and achieve a glorious, highly personalized ideological mission. They truly believe they are the uniquely chosen savior of their people.
And from that flows the second criterion, which is a profound identification with the state. The leader begins to literally conflate their own personal destiny, their own ego, with the destiny of the entire nation.
It's the modern psychological incarnation of the French King Louis XIV saying, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." You can actually diagnose this linguistically. You'll notice a shift in their speeches when a leader starts reflexively using the royal we instead of I.
Like, we're doing this, when they just mean themselves.
Exactly. Or, more dangerously, when they view any personal criticism of their behavior or any legal challenge to their wealth as a treasonous attack on the country itself. In their mind, they and the nation are a single biological organism.
That naturally leads to the third symptom, a total sweeping contempt for expert advice. Because they possess this unshakable, grandiose belief in their own messianic judgment, they reject the input of specialists. Generals, economists, scientists, diplomats, they are all dismissed as weak or foolish because they don't possess the leader's instincts.
Which is justified in their mind by the fourth criterion. They believe they are accountable only to history or to God.
So courts don't matter.
They mentally reject the judgment of earthly courts, of parliaments, of election commissions, or the press. The mundane rules of human society simply don't apply to them because they are operating on a higher, almost theological plane of historical destiny.
And when you put all of that together, you get the fifth, and perhaps the most dangerous criterion, a complete detachment from reality, coupled with intense, almost suicidal recklessness.
They lose all grounding.
Because they only listen to their own instincts and believe they are chosen by destiny, they become entirely focused on their big picture vision. They ignore practical logistical details, financial costs, and human collateral damage. They make impulsive, high-stakes decisions without any basic rational analysis.
This profound detachment from reality breeds two distinct psychological phenomena that the text explores deeply. The first is the Icarus complex. We all know the myth of Icarus flying too close to the sun because his wax wings melted.
The classic warning against pride.
In a clinical sense, the leader, intoxicated by past successes and surrounded exclusively by terrified sycophants who refuse to ground them in reality, wildly overestimates their own abilities. They genuinely believe they are exempt from the basic laws of logistics, economics, and probability. They fly too close to the sun because their brain refuses to acknowledge human limitations.
And while they're flying high on that grandiosity, the shadow of that absolute power creeps in. The text calls this the Macbeth effect. As the leader solidifies their absolute control, they inevitably have to eliminate rivals and destroy the democratic mechanisms of accountability.
It's the only way to stay in control.
But doing so creates a massive epistemological crisis. By silencing critics and demanding absolute loyalty, nobody dares to tell the leader the truth anymore, which means the leader suddenly realizes they can't trust the information they are getting. They can't trust anyone. It's the ultimate dictator's trap.
The authors use Shakespeare's Macbeth as the perfect clinical illustration of this. Macbeth murders his way to the crown, but the crown brings no peace. Instead, we see the fatal, toxic interaction of deep paranoia, repressed subconscious guilt over how the power was acquired, and, crucially, severe sleep deprivation.
The sleep deprivation is such a key detail that people overlook. Dictators are notoriously bad sleepers. Stalin, Hitler, they kept insane nocturnal hours.
And medically, sleep deprivation destroys the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotion. It exacerbates the paranoia and the impulsivity. Macbeth's curse of sleeplessness forces the leader to remain constantly, exhaustingly vigilant to protect their ill-gotten power.
So they're just biologically exhausted.
Completely. But that very biological vigilance, the lack of REM sleep, physically drives them toward madness and delusion.
So we have built this incredibly vivid, terrifying picture of the sick brain. A brain addicted to the dopamine of dominance, its empathetic mirror circuits completely fried, suffering from the grandiosity of Hubris Syndrome and driven mad by the paranoia and sleeplessness of the Macbeth effect. But the source material doesn't stop at the individual. It scales this pathology up. It transitions us from looking at the sick brain to diagnosing a sick system.
This is a pivotal turn in the research, where the text introduces its dialectical, materialist, or Marxist perspective. Now, whether you agree with Marxist economics or not, the analytical framework they apply here is fascinating.
It's a completely different way to look at it.
Many mainstream centrist political scientists look at a figure like Donald Trump and they label him a populist aberration. They see him as a glitch in the matrix, an inexplicable anomaly that temporarily hijacked the American political system. But this source text argues the exact polar opposite.
Right, it says he isn't a glitch at all. It posits that Trump is the logical, inevitable, biological embodiment of a decaying economic system. The text uses a very specific, evocative term: senile capitalism.
Let's break down what they mean by senile capitalism. The text paints a picture of a global imperialist system established largely post-World War II that has lost its motor coordination.
Like it's literally aging and failing.
According to this view, the capitalist system can no longer innovate or generate widespread, rising prosperity for the masses. It survives only through parasitic financial speculation, debt cycles, and squeezing the working class. It is a system in deep terminal structural crisis.
And the argument is that a dying, senile system can't be saved by a polite, rule-following politician. The established rules of the liberal order, things like the World Trade Organization, NATO, massive multilateral trade agreements, these rules were built for an era of undisputed American hegemony.
When America made the rules for everyone.
Right. But now, according to the text, a faction of domestic capital feels intensely threatened by rising global competitors, primarily China. These old rules are strangling them.
And to break those entrenched global rules, the system doesn't need a careful, consensus-building diplomat. It requires a destroyer. It needs a wrecking ball.
A wrecking ball, wow.
The text argues that Trump's specific neuropathological impulsivity, his total lack of respect for tradition, his narcissistic willingness to overturn the geopolitical chessboard just for the dopamine hit of the spectacle, makes him the perfect, unconscious, psychopolitical instrument for a dying system that desperately needs to dismantle its own historical constraints to survive a little longer.
So he's not an accident.
He isn't a mistake. He is the system's underlying economic pathology made physically manifest in a human being.
That is a staggering way to view history.
Yeah.
But diagnosing this pathology, taking these massive geopolitical and economic ideas and tying them to the specific deteriorating brain of a single living politician, brings up a massive ethical debate in the psychiatric community. The text doesn't shy away from this debate.
It is a debate that has deeply fractured the American psychiatric profession. On one side of the argument, you have the American Psychiatric Association's staunch defense of what is known as the Goldwater Rule.
Where does that rule come from?
It was established after the 1964 presidential election involving the conservative candidate Barry Goldwater. During that campaign, a magazine published a poll of psychiatrists diagnosing Goldwater from afar, claiming he was psychologically unfit.
That sounds incredibly messy.
It was highly controversial and seen as politically weaponized psychiatry. In response, the APA established a strict ethical rule. It forbids psychiatrists from offering professional diagnoses or clinical opinions of public figures they have not personally clinically examined in a private setting.
To protect the profession.
The argument is that distance diagnosis is inherently speculative, scientifically unsound, and profoundly damaging to the profession's neutral credibility.
It makes sense. You don't want doctors diagnosing people based on heavily edited television interviews. But the source text firmly champions the opposing view. It highlights a massive movement of dissenting psychiatric professionals who invoke a different ethical mandate: the duty to warn, commonly known as the Tarasov principle.
The Tarasov principle stems from a landmark legal case. It generally dictates that if a therapist, in the course of their work, determines that a patient poses a specific, imminent, and violent threat to an identifiable person, the therapist's duty to protect the public overrides the duty of patient confidentiality. They must break confidence and warn the victim.
And these dissenting psychiatrists in the source material are basically taking the Tarasov principle and applying it globally.
On a massive scale, yes.
They argue that when a leader possesses the absolute authority to launch a nuclear strike, when they have the codes right next to them, and that leader is publicly, consistently displaying obvious, deteriorating neurological and psychiatric symptoms, that constitutes an unprecedented global emergency.
Their argument is that the ethical imperative to protect human civilization from nuclear annihilation vastly overrides the professional decorum of the Goldwater Rule. They argue that while they haven't sat in a room with the individual, they have access to what they call massive L data or life data.
Which is what? Just watching his rallies.
It's thousands upon thousands of hours of unscripted video, audio recordings, spontaneous social media posts, and verified observational reports over decades.
That's a lot of data.
They argue that for a public figure of this magnitude, the L data provides a vastly richer, more comprehensive behavioral baseline than a standard 45-minute clinical interview where a patient might just try to hide their symptoms.
And the source material dives deeply, almost uncomfortably, into that L data. It specifically points to events and behaviors projected into the 2025 and 2026 timeframe to build a very rigid clinical portrait of cognitive decline. I want to go through these specific symptoms because the text gets highly granular here, and I want to understand what is actually happening in the brain. The first major symptom they identify is confabulation.
Confabulation is a fascinating and deeply misunderstood neurological phenomenon.
They book up a specific anecdote from a projected 2025 rally. The text says Trump allegedly tells a highly detailed, passionate story to the crowd about his uncle, Dr. John Trump, who is a professor at MIT. He claims that his uncle directly mentored the infamous Unabomber Ted Kaczynski while they were supposedly both roaming the halls of MIT together.
Right. And the text immediately points out the objective, factual impossibilities of this narrative. Dr. John Trump died in 1985. Ted Kaczynski was not even identified or caught as the Unabomber until 1996. Furthermore, Kaczynski attended Harvard for his undergraduate degree and the University of Michigan for his graduate work. He never attended MIT.
So a normal person listening to that just thinks, okay, politicians lie. They exaggerate to make themselves sound connected to interesting historical events.
And that is exactly where neurologists draw a very sharp, crucial line. A political lie is a strategic, conscious choice. The liar knows the truth, but intentionally chooses to present a falsehood to gain an advantage. Confabulation is entirely different.
It's not a lie.
No. Confabulation occurs when there is physical damage or metabolic dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for organizing memories and verifying facts.
So it's a hardware failure, not a moral failure.
Precisely. The brain literally experiences a pothole, a gap in its memory sequence. Because the brain hates voids, it unconsciously automatically fills that hole with fabricated material.
It just makes it up on the spot.
It stitches together random fragments of information, old conversations, and stray associations to create a narrative bridge over the gap. The crucial factor is that the patient isn't intentionally lying. Their reality testing mechanism is broken. They genuinely, completely believe the false truth they just invented.
So his brain just grabbed the file for Smart Uncle, grabbed the file for Crazy Genius Unabomber, and smashed them together to fill a blank space. That is terrifying. Then the text points to changes in speech patterns, specifically a medical term called phonemic paraphasia, and what Trump himself has publicly defended as the weave. The authors note a dramatic, measurable drop in language complexity, vocabulary, and syntax compared to unscripted interviews he gave in the 1980s and 90s.
Let's address phonemic paraphasia first. This involves mixing up the sounds or syllables within words, slurring complex consonants, or occasionally generating entirely nonsense words.
But just gibberish.
In a clinical setting, this can indicate microvascular damage or slow neurodegeneration in the brain's primary language centers, specifically Broca's area, which handles speech production, or Wernicke's area, which handles comprehension.
And what about the rambling? The text uses an example where Trump is having a high-stakes, highly structured meeting with the president of the European Commission. Right in the middle of a discussion on tariffs, he suddenly shifts topics and launches into an incoherent 5-minute tangent about whales washing up on beaches and windmills causing cancer.
And when journalists or critics question him about these bizarre, rambling tangents, Trump vigorously defends it. He claims it is an intentional, brilliant rhetorical strategy. He calls it the weave, claiming he is bringing disparate, complex ideas together in a way only a genius could understand.
But the neurologists in the text don't buy that at all.
Not for a second. From a neurological perspective, this phenomenon is known as tangentiality, or in more severe cases, word salad. It is viewed clinically as a severe loss of executive function. A healthy prefrontal cortex exerts cognitive control. It suppresses random thoughts to maintain a linear logical train of thought toward a goal.
So the weave is just the brakes failing.
The weave shows a brain that has lost that inhibitory control. It is constantly derailed by intrusive, random associations. If he sees a glass of water, he talks about rain, which makes him talk about umbrellas, which makes him talk about an umbrella factory he visited 10 years ago. He is no longer steering the car of his own thoughts. He is just a passenger.
The physical symptoms analyzed in the text are just as alarming. They highlight instances of severe somnolence, meaning falling asleep. But not just taking a nap on a Sunday. They project him falling asleep during highly classified, critical military briefings regarding active conflicts, or dozing off prominently at an event like the Pope's funeral.
And again, the medical community cited in the text distinguishes this from simple, benign, age-related fatigue. If you or I are tired, we might nod off on the couch watching TV.
Sure, that's normal.
But falling asleep in high-stress, intensely stimulating environments, surrounded by generals discussing life-and-death scenarios, suggests a deep... When you see unilateral weakness like dragging just the right leg or the loss of fine motor coordination required to drink from a glass smoothly, neurologists look for cumulative damage. This can often be the result of a series of transient ischemic attacks, commonly known as TIAs or mini-strokes, which leave tiny areas of dead tissue in the motor pathways.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Despite all these independent, observational red flags of decline, the official White House medical reports present a picture of an almost superhuman, miraculous state of health. But the text hones in on one specific thing Trump constantly talks about. He constantly brags at rallies and in interviews about getting a perfect score on the MOCA test.
Ah, yes, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or MOCA.
Right, and he talks about it like he just passed a bar exam or got a perfect score on the SATs or joined Mensa. He challenges reporters to take it, implying it's a test of sheer intellectual dominance.
This is perhaps the most vital point of clinical context in the entire document regarding his self-awareness. The MOCA is emphatically not an intelligence test.
Not at all.
It does not measure complex executive judgment, it doesn't measure abstract reasoning, and it certainly doesn't measure the cognitive capacity required to navigate complex geopolitical crises or nuclear standoffs.
So what is it?
It is a very basic, blunt screening tool designed by neurologists solely to detect mild cognitive impairment or the early onset stages of dementia. The tasks are incredibly rudimentary. They involve things like drawing a simple clock face and putting the hands at 10 past 11.
Really? Drawing a clock?
Or the examiner points to a line drawing of a common animal like a lion, a rhinoceros, or a camel and asks the patient to name it, or asking the patient what day of the week it is.
So if a healthy 40-year-old takes it, what happens?
A healthy, cognitively intact adult is expected to get a perfect score of 30 out of 30 effortlessly in about 10 minutes without breaking a sweat. It shouldn't even feel like a test.
It's just reciting facts.
The fact that a world leader who commands the largest military in history perceives this basic baseline dementia screening as a rigorous, difficult intellectual challenge and feels the pathological need to publicly boast about passing it is presented by the authors as a paradoxical, terrifying confirmation of how incredibly low his internal cognitive standards have fallen.
Okay, so we have this deeply detailed, documented argument for organic cognitive decline. The hardware is breaking down. But the text argues that the true danger isn't just the decline itself, it's how that cognitive decline interacts with a deeply entrenched aggressive personality disorder. A failing brain is sad, but a failing brain governed by a specific pathology is dangerous. This takes us into the darker psychological diagnosis of malignant narcissism.
The text moves past standard narcissistic personality disorder here and utilizes a very specific framework developed by the renowned psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg. Kernberg described malignant narcissism as a highly toxic, dangerous, and largely untreatable psychiatric syndrome. It is comprised of a potent combination of 4 distinct elements.
Let's break down those 4 elements because they seem to explain everything about his leadership style. The first is obviously narcissism itself.
Yes, the foundational layer. This is the grandiose sense of self-importance, the absolute insatiable need for constant admiration from crowds and subordinates, and the deeply held belief that they are uniquely special, historically significant, and therefore entirely above the laws and rules that govern ordinary, lesser people.
The second element of Kernberg syndrome is paranoia. And the text notes how, when this individual gains power, this paranoia isn't just a private fear, it becomes institutionalized. The leader projects their own internal sense of always being under siege onto the outside world. They portray the independent judiciary, the free press, the FBI, or the intelligence agencies as a massive, coordinated, deep state conspiracy actively out to get them.
That institutionalized paranoia justifies the third pillar, which is antisocial personality disorder, traditionally referred to as sociopathy. This manifests politically as a chronic, unhesitating willingness to lie, to manipulate facts, and to violate constitutional laws and democratic norms without feeling any genuine sense of remorse, guilt, or shame.
No empathy, y'all.
The text points to a callous disregard for the collateral damage of their policies. If a tariff destroys thousands of family farms or a border policy separates children from parents, it doesn't register emotionally. Human lives are viewed merely as leverage points in a negotiation.
And the fourth element, which the text argues is perhaps the most disturbing, is sadism.
Sadism is defined clinically as the derivation of pleasure, satisfaction, or ego enhancement from inflicting pain, humiliation, or degradation on others.
Enjoying a cruelty.
In a political context, the text argues this is highly visible in his behavior. It's seen in the childish but vicious invention of demeaning nicknames for political opponents, the obsessive keeping of revenge lists, or the use of violent rhetoric that intentionally incites cruelty against marginalized groups or immigrants. It's not just a calculated political tactic to fire up a base. The leader genuinely, viscerally enjoys the suffering and humiliation of their perceived enemies.
This combination of traits, the grandiosity, the paranoia, the sociopathy, the cruelty, brings us to a fascinating historical comparison regarding foreign policy strategy. Because when we talk about erratic, dangerous leaders, people always bring up the madman theory. I've heard pundits apply this to Trump constantly. Let me see if I have the history right. During the Cold War, President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, deliberately tried to make the Soviet Union and the North Vietnamese think that Nixon was highly volatile, angry, and unhinged enough to actually drop nuclear weapons on Vietnam.
Yes, that was the strategy.
They thought if the enemy believed Nixon was a literal madman who couldn't be reasoned with, they would panic and negotiate out of sheer terror. Is that what Trump is doing? Is he just playing the madman card?
That is exactly what many mainstream analysts and hopeful allies assume. They desperately want to believe there is a hidden rationality. But the source text makes a crucial, fundamental distinction here that changes everything. Nixon was faking it.
He was acting.
The madman theory under Nixon was a highly calculated, rationally planned strategy executed by a cunning, sober politician trying to create a specific, measured deterrence effect in Moscow. He knew exactly what he was doing.
But with Trump, the text argues it is not a strategy. He's not faking it.
Exactly. The impulsivity, the erratic shifts in policy, the grandiose threats of nuclear annihilation on social media, these are not a performance. They are the pathological reality of a brain suffering from malignant narcissism and untreated cognitive decline. And because it's a real pathology and not a controlled strategy, it completely lacks the consistency required for deterrence to actually work.
Because if you are faking being crazy to scare someone, you still have an end goal. You still know when to pull back.
Precisely. But a malignant narcissist acts entirely on the emotion of the moment. One day he is threatening fire and fury like the world has never seen, and the next day he is writing beautiful love letters and saluting the generals of the exact same dictator.
It's totally whiplash.
This pathological unpredictability doesn't terrify adversaries into submission. It destroys the foundational architecture of global trust. Allies quickly realize that treaties and agreements are worthless because they can be torn up based on a mood swing. Adversaries realize that apocalyptic threats might just be momentary emotional outbursts triggered by a cable news segment. The text argues that this destruction of the madman deterrence leads directly to the chaotic, dangerous isolation of the United States on the global stage.
Okay, so we've mapped out the damaged hardware and the toxic software. But what does this all actually mean when a brain operating under these specific, deteriorating conditions is handed the steering wheel of the world's largest superpower? The text doesn't just leave this in the realm of psychiatric theory. It takes this entire neuropolitical framework and applies it to 3 major geopolitical case studies, projecting how this pathology will shape the world in the 2025-2026 timeline. Let's look at the first one, which focuses on Venezuela and something they call the Don Roe Doctrine.
To understand the massive crisis projected for 2026, the text traces the pathology back to a very real, very bizarre event in 2020 known as Operation Gideon. This was a completely amateurish attempt by an American private security firm utilizing a handful of former Special Forces mercenaries and Venezuelan dissidents to infiltrate Venezuela on small boats and kidnap the entrenched president, Nicolas Maduro. It was intercepted immediately and failed spectacularly.
It literally read like a bad, straight-to-DVD 80s action movie script.
But the text argues that the administration's tacit support for this failure was deeply rooted in the leader's clinical reality testing breakdown. The administration, heavily fueled by its own right-wing propaganda and a bubble of sycophantic advisors, genuinely believed their own
And
fiction.
they bought their own hype.
They believed that a tiny, disorganized push would cause the Venezuelan military regime to magically collapse, and that the public would flood the streets to welcome the mercenaries as liberators. They completely ignored the complex, on-the-ground reality of deeply entrenched armed militias, Cuban intelligence support, and pervasive anti-imperialist sentiment. The narcissistic ego simply filtered out any intelligence briefings that contradicted its desired fantasy narrative.
And that delusion sets the stage for the massive, terrifying escalation the text projects for January 2026. The authors describe an unprecedented, highly covert operation where U.S. Special Forces actually succeed. They infiltrate Caracas and successfully capture Maduro and his inner circle. But the text points out that the truly pathological, world-breaking moment isn't the military operation itself, it's the impromptu press conference Trump gives immediately afterward, standing at a podium at his Mar-a-Lago golf resort.
This is where the clinical diagnosis steps out of the medical journals and right onto the global podium. Trump announces to the world that because the Venezuelan government has been removed, he and his administration will essentially run the country of Venezuela directly from his resort in Florida until a suitable transition can be arranged.
That is just wow.
He casually talks about sending in American oil executives to straighten out the rigs and start making money for the U.S. Treasury to pay for the operation.
I just want to pause and picture that. Running a sovereign nation of 30 million people, a country in the midst of a deep, hyperinflationary economic depression, and a simmering civil war from a dining room at a golf club in Florida.
The text highlights this specific scenario as the ultimate, undeniable break from reality and a profound manifestation of an omnipotence delusion. It perfectly clinically encapsulates the Hubris Syndrome criteria of the messianic position and a total catastrophic detachment from logistical, military, and diplomatic reality. Furthermore, the text states that this event codifies what it calls the Donroe Doctrine, a portmanteau of Donald and the historical Monroe Doctrine.
The Monroe Doctrine was from the 1800s, right? Telling Europe to stay out of South America.
Yes, the original 1823 Monroe Doctrine was ostensibly defensive, warning European colonial powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But the Donroe Doctrine is an aggressive, overt, unapologetic assertion of absolute imperial hegemony. It completely abandons any polite pretense of international law, national sovereignty, or human rights. It reduces all of geopolitics to a pure, unvarnished exercise of Nietzsche's will to power. The hemisphere belongs to the strongest man.
This theme of viewing entire sovereign nations not as complex societies, but as mere pieces of property to be acquired, brings us to the second, incredibly surreal case study, Greenland.
Yes. What started back in 2019 as a seemingly absurd off-the-cuff pitch to purchase the massive island of Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark resurfaces in the text's 2025-2026 timeline as a full-blown, terrifying global security crisis. The text tracks the pathological escalation from a bizarre real estate whim to a massive legislative push called the Big Beautiful Bill.
Of course it's called that.
This bill allocated unprecedented funding for total Arctic dominance, framing the acquisition of Greenland no longer as a quirky purchase, but as a dire existential national security imperative to counter Russian submarines and Chinese icebreakers.
And obviously Denmark, a sovereign democracy and a NATO ally, says, no, Greenland is not for sale. It's not a golf course. And the response from the administration is pure, punitive, narcissistic escalation. Trump threatens to slap a crippling 25% tariff on all exports from 8 major European allies until Denmark caves and agrees to sell. He also promises to build a $175 billion missile shield over the entire island, which he brands the Golden Dome if he gets the deed. But there's a detail in the text about why Greenland, of all places, became the ultimate obsession that absolutely blew my mind.
You're referring to the Mercator illusion.
Yes. Okay, think about the standard map projection we all grew up looking at in elementary school classrooms, the Mercator projection. Because it takes a 3D globe and flattens it out into a rectangle, it heavily distorts the size of land masses near the North and South poles. On that specific map, Greenland looks absolutely gargantuan. It looks roughly the same size as the entire continent of Africa. But in reality, Africa is about 14 times larger than Greenland.
And the text argues a profound neurological point here. This simple, common visual distortion acted as a massive, irresistible trigger for the leader's primitive, narcissistic desire. The sheer, perceived physical size of the landmass fed the fragile ego's endless need for grandiosity. The internal monologue is simply, look how big it is on the map. I am the biggest, therefore the biggest thing should belong to me.
It's literally that simple for him.
The authors use this to demonstrate how primitive, almost childlike visual stimuli can completely bypass complex strategic planning, economic theory, and military analysis in a brain fundamentally driven by impulse and ego.
And the proposed plan to handle the actual human beings, the 56,000 citizens of Greenland, is equally revealing of the pathology. The text mentions a proposal circulating in the administration to simply pay every single citizen of Greenland a lump sum, between $10,000 and $100,000, to pack their bags, leave their ancestral island, and move to mainland Denmark.
This is the absolute epitome of the transactional mindset that characterizes malignant narcissism. Complex, qualitative human factors, indigenous culture, deep ancestral ties to the land, community bonds, loyalty, patriotism, these concepts are utterly invisible to this type of brain because they cannot be monetized or dominated. Everything, every human relationship is reduced to a stark dollar amount. The core belief is that everyone has a price. Human beings are not citizens with rights. They are just annoying inventory that needs to be cleared out to make way for the ultimate real estate deal.
Which brings us to the third arena of geopolitical analysis, the Middle East.
Yeah.
The text looks at the famous Abraham Accords through this exact same transactional lens.
Traditionally, Middle East peace processes, for all their flaws, focus heavily on the complex, deeply entrenched historical and human rights issues, specifically the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. They debated borders, rights of return, and religious sovereignty. The text argues that the Abraham Accords completely bypassed this psychological complexity. It treated the conflict not as a human rights issue, but as a luxury real estate and infrastructure investment project.
Because a narcissistic transactional mind struggles with abstract concepts. Justice, historical grievance, trauma. You can't buy those.
Exactly. The narcissistic brain prefers tangible, purchasable, shiny things. Trade deals, security packs, luxury hotel developments, weapons contracts. The Accords essentially attempted to buy regional peace by utterly ignoring the core political disputes of the Palestinians. It was a strategy of categorization, breaking the region neatly into winners who sign the lucrative deals and losers who refuse and are subsequently ignored and impoverished.
But the Middle East also provides the clearest, most dangerous example of the leader's impulsivity and paranoia, specifically regarding the conflict with Iran. The text argues that the initial decision to pull the U.S. out of the JCPOA, the carefully negotiated Iran nuclear deal, wasn't based on a rigorous, multi-agency strategic review of the treaty's effectiveness. It was driven primarily by a malignant, narcissistic need to destroy the defining legacy of a perceived personal rival, former President Barack Obama.
It is the compulsion to erase the predecessor's achievement and overwrite history with one's own signature. But the deeper, more alarming neurological analysis focuses on the 2020 assassination of the top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. The text frames this incredibly risky escalation not as a calculated military strike designed to achieve a long-term goal, but as a pure biological amygdala hijack.
Let's explain that. What is an amygdala hijack?
The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure deep in the brain that serves as our primary fear and threat processing center. It's the alarm bell. Following a rocket attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad by Iranian-backed militias, the text argues that Trump was suddenly consumed by an overwhelming, panicked fear of looking weak on television. Specifically, he was terrified of experiencing a repeat of the 2012 Benghazi embassy attack, which had been a major, damaging political talking point for years.
So his ego felt uniquely threatened.
Yes. This intense, sudden fear and the perceived threat to his personal image of strength triggered a massive stress response that literally bypassed the rational, forward-planning functions of the prefrontal cortex entirely. The higher-order thinking shut down, and the brain defaulted to a primitive, evolutionary fight-or-flight response. In this hijacked state, the most extreme option presented by the military, the assassination of a sovereign state's top general, was chosen impulsively. It wasn't chosen to solve the Middle East crisis. It was chosen instantly to neutralize the leader's internal feeling of vulnerability and to project an image of immediate, violent strength, regardless of the massive long-term strategic fallout or the risk of triggering World War III.
Reading through these three case studies, Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, I noticed a really bizarre, almost contradictory asymmetry in how the text describes his approach to global conflict. On one hand, he absolutely loves economic warfare.
Mm.
He embraces massive tariffs, crippling sanctions, freezing central bank assets. It perfectly fits his schema. His brain understands wealth, property, and using money as a blunt weapon to crush rivals. But on the other hand, he exhibits a deep, almost phobic fear of actual kinetic military warfare. Why is that?
It's a very astute observation, and it traces right back to the need for absolute control. Economic warfare is clean, it is transactional, and it feels like total dominance from the safety of an Oval Office desk. But military conflict is inherently chaotic. It is unpredictable. The enemy gets a vote. It involves vast moving systems, generals, troops, weather, logistics that he cannot entirely personally control. To a narcissistic ego that demands absolute omnipotence, the fog of war is terrifying because it threatens to expose their limitations and their lack of total control.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of these seemingly disconnected case studies, the cartoonish hostage-taking of an entire country's leadership in Venezuela, the attempt to literally buy a massive island through extortion and tariffs, the impulsive drone strikes driven by television anxiety, they all point toward a fundamental physiological reordering of how reality itself is processed by the leader's brain, specifically regarding the core concepts of winning and losing.
And this brings us to one of the most profound biological insights in the text, the winner-loser neurobiology.
Let's talk about the basal ganglia.
Right. In a healthy, neurotypical human brain, there is a specific mechanism within the basal ganglia associated with what biologists call the loser effect. When you and I experience a defeat, whether it's getting passed over for promotion, losing a tennis match, or losing a political election, we experience a drop in our perceived social hierarchy. When that happens, this biological mechanism kicks in. It physically inhibits our aggressive impulses, it allows our ego to process and accept the loss, and it helps us adapt our behavior to our new, diminished reality.
It's basically an evolutionary safety valve. If we didn't have it, every time someone cut us off in traffic or beat us in Monopoly, we would fight them to the death. It allows society to function.
Precisely. But the text argues forcefully that in this specific clinical profile, the malignant narcissist suffering from Hubris Syndrome and cognitive decline, that vital inhibition mechanism is completely structurally broken. The brain is literally biologically incapable of processing the concept of losing.
It just rejects the data entirely.
It registers a loss not as a temporary social setback or a political reality, but as a fatal existential threat to the ego's very existence. Therefore, when objective reality clearly and undeniably states you lost, as it did in the aftermath of the 2020 election, the fragile ego must protect itself from annihilation at all costs. It does this by aggressively, frantically manufacturing alternative facts. It bends, distorts, and shatters reality, creating massive, elaborate fictions and global conspiracy theories to explain away the defeat. Because actually accepting the objective, mathematical reality of the loss would cause a total psychological collapse.
And here is the terrifying conclusion the text leads us to. When a brain that operates by fundamentally distorting reality in order to survive holds the most powerful, influential office on Earth, the consequences don't stay contained in the Oval Office. They radiate outward, infecting the entire culture. It creates what the authors ominously call a malign normality.
This is the ultimate systemic danger identified in the source material. The pathology does not remain contained within the leader's skull. Through the sheer gravity of their power, it infects the entire political and global system. Actions, rhetoric, and policies that were previously universally condemned as illegal, profoundly unethical, or dangerously unhinged gradually become normalized. They become accepted as the new, grim, standard operating procedure.
The guardrails of civilization just dissolve. And you see it happen in real time. International relations shift from being based on long-term, stable alliances, historical treaties, and mutual trust to becoming paranoid, purely transactional, momentary interactions. Friends and allies of decades are abandoned the moment they aren't immediately financially useful, and brutal dictators are courted if it serves a fleeting narcissistic impulse or provides a good photo op.
The established rule of international law, the intricate systems of diplomacy we spent a century building to prevent a Third World War, are slowly but surely replaced by the brutal law of the jungle. It reverts to a world where the only metric of right and wrong, the only truth that matters, is the raw, unchecked application of power by the strongest, most ruthless actor.
It is a profoundly unsettling, dark vision of how deeply our shared global reality is shaped not by grand theories, but by the unseen, failing biology of the people in charge.
And that leads me to a final, underlying thought that really crystallizes the immense weight of this entire analysis for me. We spend our lives endlessly debating the intricate policies of governments. We argue over the theoretical checks and balances of our constitutional systems, the movement of interest rates, and the grand sweeping arcs of human history. We build these massive, labyrinthine institutions to manage global economies and control world-ending nuclear arsenals. We tell ourselves we are safe because the system is strong. But ultimately, this text reveals a terrifying truth. All of human civilization, with its unimaginable power, wealth, and complexity, is delicately, precariously tethered to the fragile biological health of a single human prefrontal cortex. It forces us to ask a question that should keep us all awake at night. Are our global systems truly robust and resilient, or are they, at the end of the day, entirely at the mercy of one individual's neurochemistry?
Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.